Nowadays, everyone has encountered technology in some form or another, whether by using your mobile phones, the internet, or ATM. But what does a smart city mean for the general public? Is smart city and its usage only limited to technologically and economically advanced cities? What kind of data are sourced and handled in smart cities, and how does this affect citizen engagement? In this episode, we discuss how smart city can be used in everyday life, what roles citizens have in developing a smart city, and the responsibility each stakeholder have in a digital society.
Hi everyone, welcome back to Coffee Break with Urbana. I'm here right now at Delft, about to meet Dr. Roy Bendor. Roy is Assistant Professor of Critical Design at the Faculty of Industrial Design Engineering. He is interested in the social, political, and environmental context of design, and we're going to talk to him about that in a little bit. Hi everyone, we're now with Roy Bendor. He's here having coffee with me, and for both cities. We're here with Roy Bendor, and we're going to talk about citizens for smart city. But first, because Roy's interest is on social, political, and environmental context of design. So I just want to find out what imagining futures and critical design is.
Okay.
Because that's what you're specializing in, right?
Yeah. Well, critical design is an approach to design that looks at both social critiques of design, so trying to understand the social roles and contexts and consequences of design, but also tries to understand how design can serve as a form of social critique. So it's a way both to understand some of the things that are perhaps not going as well in society and how they could be remedied. So that's the kind of stuff that I'm interested in. And that lends itself to both the political questions of representation and inclusivity, to questions of culture, specificity, local cultures, and of course questions of the environment.
And when you talk about specificity and the context of culture and the environment, and does that include also representation, diversity, which is also part of the urban ecosystem?
Absolutely. Isn't that part of why we like cities so much? Because they are so diverse, and because they are full of surprises and people who are not clones of ourselves. So, absolutely, questions of both representation in data and models and in everyday life are crucial, especially since so much of urban life is designed these ways. It is designed in ways that could either amplify or attenuate these kind of questions. And it's also a very important question in the context of smart cities. One of the perhaps the biggest critiques of smart cities is that they kind of promote this universal one-size-fits-all model of urban planning, right? So what works in Mumbai would work in Dubai, would work in Caracas, and in New York. So these are part of the things that I'm thinking about in my work, certainly.
So in that context, you're also working with both cities, right?
Yeah.
And how do you? Because what I'm really interested in the design aspect and what your specialization is in terms of the critical design infrastructure, critical design for infrastructures is how do you design for cities that are let's say in the global south compared to the global north? How do you put that that smart city context in the global south? Let's say you mentioned Mumbai, because you can't, as you said, no one size fits all. And I love that line. I always say that as well. That there's no one size fits all. How do you design something that is for let's say a least developed country or less developed city compared to a more developed city?
Well, it's a very complex question, and I have to warn you, I don't have an answer for it. But I think first, we have to think about what do we mean by smart city to begin with, or where's the appeal? Why do we even think that every city should be a smart city, right?
Yeah.
And so, what we call smart cities usually just mean urban systems that rely heavily on technology to help bureaucrats understand the city, so see what's going on and then make decisions based on that. And it's of course very appealing to integrate all forms of technology into the urban fabric. In fact, that's been done for a while. If you think about the histories of cities, modes of transportation and other technologies, electricity changed the way cities are built. So it's not the first time that technology figures in the way that we understand cities. But I think the smart city, in that sense, is really kind of a very powerful imaginary. It fits really well with how we understand or how we'd like to think about technology these days. About the power of artificial intelligence and a lot of data to help us make better decisions, help us make cities more efficient, help us perhaps overcome decades of neglect by neoliberal politics. Cities are in financial holes. Climate change is a big problem. So creating resilience in cities is a big challenge. So there's quite a bit of an appeal into sprinkling with a little bit of magic dust every city. That magic dust now is the smart city, right? And then hoping that technology would help us do things better. But that is certainly part of the problem. So if we look at different cities, we can imagine that they're all, if you've traveled around the world, right, you notice that not all cities are the same. Every city has a different components, has a different feel, has a different vibe to it. And so the question of how do you tailor or customize technological solutions to different cities is really a question of engaging the local culture and local population and seeing what works best. And that is perhaps one of the things that people are bothered by, or one of the strong critiques of the smart city is that is not done. Instead of talking to people, instead of really understanding what makes a city special for those who live in it, we just plop in a couple of sensors, a couple of databases, and everything will be fine.
It's interesting because I did have an interview with someone else as well who's also into the smart city infrastructure, and he's also an urban planner like myself. And he did mention that there's really no one definition of what a smart city is. And also I think there's also for me a refusal to define it, because it's different things for different contexts and different cultures, as I believe so. In both cities, where you're also involved in, they have this idea of sharedness. And what's your view on that sharedness? Is it and how does it relate to citizen engagement for smart city design?
Well, that's not an easy question as well, right? Well, we can think about sharing in all kinds of ways. I mean, people who live in a city, by definition, share space all the time, and so we do not live in bubbles in the city. And again, this is part of why we like cities. If you want to live, surround yourself by people who are just like you and live insulated from the world, and cities are perhaps not the best place to live in.
Yeah.
So we certainly already share some of our everyday behaviors. We already share services. We already share experience in the city with others who are not like us. I think that's kind of a core sharedness in all cities. But there's also a question of which values do we share? How do we get to agree on some things? And when are we allowed to disagree without the whole city going off the rails because of that, right? One of the reasons that I like cities so much and why I work on cities is because cities kind of capture all of this diversity and allows it to both interact and maintain a sense of autonomy, right? So we could do our thing. And I think in that sense, the smart city is also read as a little bit of a threat of doing your thing because of a lot of automation of decisions, both around decisions over resources and services, but also the way that our opinions, for instance, and our positions and our values are being mediated by certain technological infrastructures. And so the question is of sharing here, I think, has to do with how we are willing to, or what we are willing to accept as as kind of urban technologies. How are we
data?
Well, data is everybody talks about data because obviously it's at the forefront, but the data is only one part of a larger chain where the everyday life, the life world, as phenomenologists like to call it, becomes digitized and turned into something that urban bureaucrats could look at and make decisions based on. So the data on itself is meaningless, and a lot of decisions are made with less data, and it doesn't mean that they're necessarily bad decisions. So again, I think this is also part of the hype around the smart city, that if we just collect a lot more data, our decisions will be better. But urban design over the last 30 years or so have really opened up to engaging the public. The idea that the urban planner, the architect, the urban designer knows everything and can make all of the decisions without consulting the people who eventually have to roam the streets, right? That has been significantly discredited.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I'm bothered by the smart city, one of the things that I'm trying to engage with in my work is this kind of a switch to automatic decision making, or the replacement of conscious, intentional participation in politics by just the giving or the passive giving of data, and assuming that that's all that we need from citizens these days. Just give us your data, and your preferences would then be automatically assumed, and decisions will be made based upon that. And that leaves a lot outside of what gets digitized, first of all, and also I think creates a bunch of, or at least has the risk of depoliticizing citizens, right? So you don't need to know the issues anymore. You don't need to be aware. You don't need to participate. All you have to do is live your life, and the data trails that you will leave, are your way of participating in urban design and urban planning and in urban decision making. And I think that's a really big problem.
Well, maybe my question would be, how do you now how do institutions and organizations, do you think, how can they engage with the citizen in the discussion on critical design and smart city?
Well, there's kind of a cluster of problems. Populations who've been kind of routinely, continuously kept out of decision making have good reasons to feel disenfranchised and not wanting to participate. I think there's a kind of a healthy sense of suspicion around what municipalities want to do, and the way to overcome it is to create long-term relations with citizens where the public feels that what they value and what they experience and what they want actually means something for bureaucrats. And it's not enough to trace their data. You actually have to create this kind of ongoing conversation on what the city is and what the city can and should be. I think the problem is that the powers that be are not always invested in such conversations because they are difficult to make, because there are a lot of reasons for people not to be happy with their everyday lives and with some of the services and some of the directions that the cities are taking. But democracy is not an outcome; it's a process. And if you're committed to that process, and if you really are genuinely interested in what the public thinks, then you find ways to do that. You find ways to create this long-term engagement instead of just plugging holes with data, so to speak, right?
So I'm interested now. Have you found places here in the Netherlands that you think are very actively engaged in your work?
I think certainly Amsterdam is a world leader in the way that it thinks about public engagement and about technology, whether it's through the Bach Institute, whether there's the Office of the CTO in the city itself, through the AMS, so the Advanced Metropolitan Solutions Institute. It seems like the city is really invested in creating these new forms of collaboration with its citizens on technology. I think other cities are coming to that point as well, where they understand that Rem Koolhaas, famous Dutch architect, he had a very, very interesting comment. He said that he understands every mayor who wants to be a mayor of a smart city, because by extension he becomes a smart mayor, right?
Yeah.
So all cities, or at least so many cities, are invested in becoming smart, but how to be smart, I think, is the big question. And I think there's something to be learned from Amsterdam. I think Rotterdam is doing some interesting things now, both in terms of thinking of the south part of the city as a living lab and not just as an excuse to do experimentation on people, but really as a way of thinking of new ways to govern urban changes and urban transitions and to give populations a voice. I certainly know that Utrecht is invested in these kind of things. Eindhoven has been working with technology for a very long time. So there's certainly no shortage of initiatives in the Netherlands, but we are really, I think, lacking some very very kind of rigorous ways to understand the consequence, the outcomes, and to improve these efforts. You asked before about academics, right? To me, as an academic, I'm probably one of the least important people involved in work around the smart cities. I think that organizers, community groups are much more important and carry much more weight and much more power in shaping, the urban life form. But if there is one thing that perhaps academics could help here, is think, how do we evaluate these initiatives? How do we make sure that all of the efforts that go into creating this infrastructure, this experimental infrastructure, these some cool initiatives around engaging people and thinking about technology creatively. How do we, create a kind of a knowledge base that could then be shared amongst cities, right? Something that learns, something that doesn't happen in small silos where cities either protect their findings or are perhaps embarrassed with some of the things that are happening in their boundaries, right? So, this is perhaps where academics could help by creating those kind of frameworks for understanding better what's going on.
Two comments. I'm really happy that you mentioned about Rotterdam because I live in the south.
Rotterdam's awesome.
I live in the south of Rotterdam, and if they're doing something in the south of Rotterdam, I'm very very excited. And also, you're right. I mean, Rotterdam, the south of Rotterdam has so many cool labs there, whether it's sustainable agriculture, sustainable community gardens, and there are so many other initiatives around the area. I didn't know about the smart city, so I'm gonna check it out where this particular smart city is. Smart city project is in Rotterdam, so I was
smart cities everywhere, don't you know?
It's
everywhere. Well, we just completed a long project in 2 neighborhoods in Rotterdam that was funded by the city of Rotterdam and in collaboration with V2 Lab, which is a very cool kind of art technology space in Rotterdam that's been active for a long time. It's kind of part of the community. And what we did is we went to 2 different neighborhoods and started to just do some ethnographic research with citizens and ask them what they valued about their neighborhood but remains hidden.
Yeah.
So instead of going and saying, well, the smart city is coming, what should we do? Or we thought, well, why talk about technology at all? We should start with people's lives, with people's values, with what people appreciate about their environment. And we found all kinds of interesting things about what differentiates one community and one neighborhood from another community, how people perceive their everyday life, and once you kind of cut through the regular complaints, and there's always reasons for people to complain, you get to pretty interesting things, pretty kind of fundamental ways in which people relate to both the urban space and the kind of life forms that take place in it. And what we did is we, after asking these 2 neighborhoods, people in these neighborhoods, what they value and remains hidden, we started to speculate. So we started to kind of imagine what kind of smart city technologies could be used to measure and then represent the things that people in the neighborhood actually care about. And so in that sense, there's a kind of an ongoing speculation about what a smart city built from the bottom up instead of the top down would look like. So instead of pursuing technologies that increase efficiency and optimization, right? Things that are important for bureaucrats and certainly important for technologists because you can show perhaps a better return on investment if you say, you would reduce this amount of, right? But instead we started to, we reversed it, we put it on its head and asked, well, what would the community perhaps like if the city would measure? What kind of data the community would think is valuable? valuable. And then we took that information and in parallel tracks, we created speculative designs. We created a speculative city dashboard that measured things that maybe bureaucrats never thought that they should measure, like ingenuity and the level of care in the neighborhood, right? And the kind of the degree to which citizens are vocal and express themselves. And did also some co-creation workshops with people where we looked specifically at care and said, well, where do you see care in your neighborhood? How does it look like? What do you value? What do you think care is? And again, the idea is then to take this kind of information forward and start thinking about what would sensors and algorithms and visualizations that focus on these things look like.
So is that the one that you wrote for the speculative design methods book?
No, but not far from it. The chapter in the speculative design book is really about a much more narrow kind of experimental futuring tool that's called value replacement therapy that just tries to help everyday people understand that technology is both value-based and technology is malleable. So if you flip around the values that shape the creation of technologies, you can come up with entirely different technologies. Right? So technology or urban technologies are not immutable, they're not unchangeable, they are flexibility, and the idea is that if you recognize that, then maybe you also discover your own ability to influence the way that technology is created and certainly the way that technology is applied and used. Right? So, we talk about engaging citizens in cities, we want them to have a voice. Well, it starts by recognizing that you do have a voice. It starts by recognizing that things could be changed.
That's true.
Right. So you gotta know that there's a problem, and you need to understand that you can do something about the problem, and then suddenly new paths for change, for transformational change, open up.
I also had a second point. Remember? So the other point that I wanted to talk about was that we talked about sharedness, right?
Yeah.
And you talked about citizens having a much better voice than the academics. That they're more important. Their voice is more important than the academics, right? So I also think that. What do you think about the idea that this smart city concept or bold cities, the role of the bold cities in creating a safer or a safe haven for discussion with the citizens?
Well, it's really important to have these discussions, but I think the responsibility for having those conversations are on policymakers.
Correct.
It's in their best interest, both for moral reasons, right?
Yeah.
But also research shows that when you engage people in policy making, the policy itself is better. Right? So why not? I think academics, the role of academics is to think about new ways perhaps to create those conversations and then to evaluate those conversations and to make sure that the knowledge that is generated through them maybe has a lasting or kind of a transferable life or value in that sense. But I don't think that the Center for Bold Cities does not replace municipalities. It is not our role to make sure that citizens are heard. That is the role of policymakers, right?
To create an enabling environment, people.
Enabling environment, and also we should think about what we mean by safe.
Yeah.
Right. We don't want an environment where anything goes on the one hand, or that people are afraid to speak on the other hand. Right?
Yeah, like what happens in some countries, in fact.
Well, that's another question, right? Like
how
do you
do that?
Can you create a democratic city, right, where people feel comfortable expressing their voice in a country that's not democratic, where there's no democratic culture, right? So I sometimes think of it as a set of nested Russian dolls. You open one, you're gonna have to open the other ones as well, and you need patience for that, and you need time for that, and you need to be invested in creating lasting relations with the community, and not just plop in, do something, and plop out as much as possible. At least we try. It doesn't always happen. It really depends, on funding and opportunities and whatnot. But if we really want to create cities that work for everyone, we have to
Yeah.
create processes that allow everyone to participate.
Correct. Yes.
Some people might not want to. Some people don't have time. But if you study long enough processes of public engagement
Yeah.
in cities, you realize that you always get the same old people, right? The
Yes.
same people come to all of the open houses, to all of the discussions. Those who have time, or those who
Yeah.
are more invested in things like real estate.
Yeah.
You
Right.
create you create an afternoon discussion, and that's where you're going to get. You're
Yeah.
going to get those who have money to money to lose or to
Yeah.
gain. So cities have to also think about that. How do you create engagement environments that appeal to everyone? How do you entice people to participate? How do you create an environment that allows people to come in and listen, not just speak, but also listen. It
And
re-
really listen, not just from here to the
Yeah.
other.
Well, as a society, we might have a problem with that these days, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, in between social media
But
and
then,
everything else.
yeah, but then it's also difficult sometimes to really sit and listen for some people, because they already have like their own set opinion on what is being offered to them.
Yeah.
That, I mean, I think that's where I'm getting at. That like we have to learn how to engage with people in such a way that they won't feel that they're being judged for not knowing or not being part of or not being integrated or something, or not being able to speak the language or
Yeah.
whatever.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Well, there's always a suspicion
Yeah.
that participation is just a tokenism, right?
Yes,
That,
yes.
you ask people what they think, and then you're gonna, the city will just
Yeah.
go and do whatever it wants anyway.
Yeah.
And I think it's incumbent on cities to show
Yeah,
that they
correct.
listen. And it's really, we have to discover our
Yeah.
agency, and it only will happen if we see that there are effects to our actions. And that's why things like tactical urbanism, for instance, are so empowering, because
Yeah.
citizens are able to take over urban space and and reimagine it, re-envision it, and remake it. And the results are right there in front of their eyes. So that you can't be, there's no sense of maybe they'll listen, maybe they won't listen. The facts are right there, they're concrete.
What is the imagining futures? Because part of your work is on imagining futures, right? So what is it about, and what is its relationship with citizen engagement?
Mm-hmm. Well, if you think about a lot of public engagement on cities, the questions that are asked are really about the future. How should we, right, in the future? We don't engage people on the past of the city. We don't ask them sometimes we do, about how they'd like history to be remembered in the city. But most public engagement processes are about the future. But how we think about the future, so what kind of assumptions we make about the future, how we see ourselves as actors whose influence might carry in time, right? How do we understand power over time? How do we understand our ability to shape some of the larger questions around urban futures are all very important. And in a sense, part of what I find fascinating about this, and part of what I try to do in my work, is create these processes, create these frameworks that allow people to really think about the future in ways that are both creative and empowering. So creative, as in try to find new paths that maybe will allow cities to grow in ways that are unanticipated, or ways that maintain certain kinds of autonomy and inclusivity for the public, and essentially open up the discussion to the future to those who will live in it to some extent, right? So a famous author once said the future is too important to be left to futurists. Really, it's us. It's up to all of us to find ways to think about the future in a society that generally discounts the future. So much of what we do is short term, right? We think about tomorrow, we think about next week, we think about maybe next year. Certainly corporations think about it, large companies think about the next quarter, cities think about the next election cycle. We are not very exercised in thinking long term, not as a species, and not as communities, and certainly not as the subjects of global capitalism. We are supposed to be always just thinking about what's next now. And so I think there's a big challenge here to open up the purview to think about longer term processes and to, I think, take advantage of the fact that when we think about the future, we can let go of some of the shackles of the present and the past, right? We can, to some extent, liberate ourselves and find new, interesting, creative ways to make cities better. And so, I think public engagement is really inseparable from thinking about the future. The question is really, how do you create these processes that foreground questions of power and inclusivity and justice, questions of how we imagine the city and how we would like it to be.
Is imagining future something that you can use when you're designing a smart city?
Oh, you have to. You have to, right? Because every infrastructure, even if it's not smart, even if it's a street or a sidewalk, takes into consideration long-term processes, right? You don't build a road because now you build a road thinking in 20 years how it's going to work. And just because we have a bit more flexibility with digital infrastructure doesn't mean that the cost is not prohibitive. It doesn't mean that it's going to be very expensive to replace some of it on the one hand. On the other hand, if you are creating processes of data collection and decision making, we have to think about how they will influence the city on the long term. So so technologies like digital twins, for instance, allow those kind of things to happen. So we create simulations over a period of time of all kinds of city processes, and we can stress test policy in that way. But if we are creating now the infrastructure of tomorrow, we have to start thinking about what tomorrow means. And we also know, for instance, that what goes into algorithms, so the quality of the data and what the data includes, will affect the decisions made by algorithms in the future. So the data that we are collecting now will still influence the decisions that we'll make in 5, 10, 20 years, who knows how long. Right? So we have to think about that now and not wait until the consequences are clear later.
Now we're going down to our last part of this show, of this coffee break with you.
Yeah.
Not really a show, but a coffee break with you. So now we're going to the last part of our coffee talk. What's your future plans?
One of the projects I'm working right now under the Bold City umbrella, which is very exciting, is called Twirl. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to figure out how digital twins, which are the latest sexy, hyped smart city technology, how can they be made more inclusive? Because digital twins rely on quite a significant amount of data, and there's certain things in the city that they make visible, and therefore, by definition, certain things in the city that they keep invisible, right? Yeah. And so what we are doing now, it's a fantastic project, and we are a collaborative group of researchers, both from Leiden and from Erasmus and Delft. What we're trying to understand is how digital twins are already used and how municipalities intend to use them, and what kind of communities are left out of process of digitization. And then what we want to see is how processes of sense-making, so understanding what's going on in the city, could be reconnected with processes of decision-making and done in a much more inclusive way. So that's a very exciting project that we're doing now with the Center for Bold City. So this is one of my future plans. But in general, most of what I am thinking these days about are how kind of different imaginaries of the city, different ways to for the public to think what the city is and how it could be improved, how they find their way into new digital technologies. So really creating cities that are as smart as their citizens.
Is this the ELSA lab?
The ELSA lab is looking at digital twins as well in a larger perspective.
But this is another part.
It's separate. It's separate, but with some overlap and some synergy.
Yeah, but I'm really keen on learning more about that one, and I'm very, very excited for the imagining futures aspect of design. And I hope I can learn more from you in the future, and we'll keep in touch.
I like that.
We'll keep in touch. So that's it for Coffee Break with Urbana, and here's our friend here, Roy Bendor.
Thanks for having me.
Bye.
Bye.
See you guys. Bye.